Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on into another podcast by George, folks. Thanks for coming along today. Got a great guest, one that I really like. I like to listen and hear and see a lot of my guests. This guy, too. I really like to read his stuff. It's Bill Astore. I mean, he's got a Substack to die for, folks. If you get a chance, go to Bill Astore on Substack and read his stuff. We're going to take a quick spin through some of it today, but this is something you should be subscribing to. You can sign up for a lot of these things for free, test it out, see if you like it, then throw him a few bucks. I mean, it is all good. Let me bring his live line graphic up on the screen, and we'll give his bio here and do an introduction. Lieutenant Colonel retired William J. Astore. He's with the Eisenhower Media Network. We might talk about Ike a little bit if we get to it on this show. He served in the U.S. Air Force for 20 years. He was a professor of history. He's written extensively for places that you may frequent: TomDispatch.com, Truth Out, History News Network, Alternate, Salon, Antiwar.com, and Huffington Post, among other sites. He's the co-author of 3 books. His most recent, Soldiers' Lives Through History, The Early Modern World. And listen to this educational background. He earned a BS with distinction in mechanical engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, an MA from the Johns Hopkins University, History of Science and Technology, and a DPhil, Doctor of Philosophy, from the University of Oxford, Modern History. He's taught at the Air Force Academy, the Naval Postgraduate School, and the Pennsylvania College of Technology. So let's take that away. Let's click a button here and bring him on in and welcome him back to Podcast by George. Hi, Bill.
Thanks, George, for that intro.
Well, I mean, it's great and it's well-deserved. Like I tell everybody, there comes a time when really all we're left with is our bio. And the final one goes on a tombstone. So make it good, folks. And you're doing exactly that. Thanks for everything that you do. And we're going to get to your Substack here. But first, I want to kind of cover some of these big news items that are looming large. This one is all over mainstream media right now. Matter of fact, MSNBC is on live this morning. I just walked by the television set and saw that. People may be aware that the most significant charges yet: Trump indicted for trying to overturn the 2020 election, holding Trump accountable for his crimes, pulls our democracy back from the precipice, and prevents his criminal attempt to overturn an election from being forgotten or normalized, said one leader. Now, some advocacy groups, now this is from Common Dreams, and there's a large article there. Go read it. But I just pulled a couple of paragraphs out of here. But I wanted to mention that some advocacy groups and constitutional experts argue that regardless of the results of his legal issues, the 14th Amendment disqualifies Trump from holding office again because he incited the 2021 insurrection. And this is very important. And Bill, you can jump in here, because there are a lot of people that say, well, if Trump can just hang on, and if he gets himself reelected, he'll be able to escape these charges that are pending against him. But there are people that are saying, now, wait a minute. The Constitution and this 14th Amendment prevents him from taking office. And, I've been on the outside looking in on this guy. I mean, I don't like to talk about him. My God, everybody talks about him enough that I don't need to. I refer to him as Captain Butt Crunch on my show. I mean, he's not a fan favorite. But is he coming back? Is he going to get indicted? Is he going to go to jail in handcuffs, or any or all of the above? What do you think's happening with old Trump?
I think the establishment is, instead of death by 1,000 cuts, they're trying death by 1,000 indictments. But
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to be enough to stop Trump. And then, of course, the other thing is, I don't really have a strong position on this, but to call what happened on January 6th an insurrection is, I think, putting it a little bit too strong. I mean, it was certainly a protest. It certainly had elements of a riot, but I don't think it was any kind of an organized insurrection as a serious attempt to overthrow the government. So the idea that what happened on January 6th is going to disqualify Trump under the 14th Amendment, I don't think legally that won't hold water.
We got a lot of things to get to today. I don't want to spend the whole show talking about Captain Butt Crunch, because we could very easily do it. I would agree with you on the insurrection thing, maybe from a slightly different angle. My belief is, from what I saw of those people and what I know, post event about those people that, crawled in the windows of the Capitol with their asses hanging out. Most of them weren't smart enough to organize an insurrection. I mean, I didn't see an attempted coup there, because that does take some leadership and some brains. And from what I could tell, most of those people didn't have it. A riot? Yeah. Trying to make a scene? Yeah. Trying to get yourself on television? Yeah. All of those types of things. Should they go to jail for that? Yeah. I mean, I'm all up with that too. But that's my point of view on the insurrection, the riot, the attempted coup, whatever you want to call it.
I always like the picture of the guy who was carrying off a podium. I think it was Nancy Pelosi's speaker's podium. A lot of those guys were kind of yahoos. They were just there to make trouble. I'm not dismissing the seriousness of what they did in some cases. We know, there was one person who was shot and killed, and police officers who died after the fact. So it was serious, but an organized insurrection or coup, it wasn't.
When we go back to this Common Dreams article here, I'll just take a look real quick to see here. The new charges against Trump on Tuesday came as two of his big lie allies in Michigan, former Attorney General candidate Matt DePerno and ex-state representative Dear Rendon, were indicted for illegally tampering with the voting machines as part of the former president's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Okay, Bill, you would know more about this than most, and you can rein me in if I'm not correct. But I've said on this show repeatedly, it's very interesting to me. It's an eye-opener. It's a revelation as to what we're all about in this nation, that somebody going back as far as Richard Nixon could be run out of Washington on a rail, on a helicopter, and not because of war crimes that he committed, not because of the illegal invasion of Cambodia and Laos and the extension of the war and his secret plan that he was going to use to get reelected and all this stuff. I'm just before that, the Gulf of Tonkin incident being faked and all that kind of stuff. That's not what brings these guys down. Brings them down. What brings them down is jiggering with the electoral system, with Watergate was kind of a minor deal, but they were screwing with the fundamentals of the electoral system. Now, Trump, with everything that he did, and I could spend an entire show on that, it's going to be that electoral system thing that's going to get him maybe down, or at least in the most trouble. And you're a big anti-war guy. You've been watching this as long as I have almost. What's your take on that?
No, I think you're right. When you take a look at presidents and their records, we see what happened with the Iraq War, for example, where there were extensive lies about the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein allegedly had that he didn't. There was the lie that somehow Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11, and of course he wasn't. And yet, both George Bush and Dick Cheney, in a way, have been rehabilitated now. I mean, George Bush is embraced by many Democrats, including the Obamas, just because he's not Trump. So you can do almost anything overseas. You can start wars that end up in the deaths of tens of thousands, if not millions of people. But if you mess around with the establishment in Washington, D.C., watch out.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't ever forget that. I talk about it ad nauseum on my show. The 1 million at least. And if you extend it out over generational and other countries and that type of thing, but because of Iraq, the little bitty babies, the boys and girls, the men and women, the innocents that are in the ground because of exactly what Bill is talking about. Nobody got brought down because of that. It's this kind of stuff, which what a statement on the system and on the country. Okay, we got to take a spin through some top news here, because I just, I can't get away without mentioning some of the news. I don't know if people saw this or not. I pasted it on Facebook, but it's very local. But this is one of these head snaps, one of these house of mirrors head shakers that I talk about on my show all the time. Urbandale. There's a place in Iowa called Urbandale, folks. We jokingly refer to it as Urbandale. Targets books for removal. The list includes the classics like Ulysses, for God's sake, and 1984. Let me read this paragraph. Hundreds of books would be banned in Urbandale schools, providing the first full scope of just how many titles could be removed from schools under a new Iowa law that forbids teaching about gender identity and prohibits publications that depict sex acts. I suppose there's, I read Ulysses. I guess there's some sex acts in there. The sirens, all that stuff. I don't know. But 1984, I do know because it was my senior class play in high school. I was in it. The fundamental basis of 1984 is governmental mind control done by things like book banning. And I think sexual stuff, even that's a part of it too, that's banned by the state in 1984. I mean, to me, this made me almost laugh out loud, Bill, but in kind of a creepy way.
No, I get it. And I live near Plymouth, Massachusetts. I thought I was supposed to be the Puritan. I thought I was supposed to be puritanical. You guys out there in Iowa are supposed to be more sensible than this. I mean, the idea that 1984. There is sex. There is some sex in 1984 between Winston Smith. Links up with one of the women. They have illicit sex, I guess, as a form of protest against the state. And part of the idea behind that book is to show how the state becomes so invasive that even our most private acts, such as sex, become forbidden and monitored and something tawdry and sinful. And so, to ban books on the basis of just because there's a sex act is ludicrous. And it does strike me as a very strange puritanical idea and then the simplistic thinking, the idea being that, well, if high school students don't read about sex, we can be sure they won't be having sex. And it's like, well, I don't think so.
That's all we thought about 24/7. All right, let me bring this up on screen because this is what I talk about all the time on the PBG on Podcast by George. It's the big three: climate, war, and healthcare, and how they're interrelated. And the point of this, and maybe you saw the promo that I had for the show today. Are they too dumb or are they in on it? That's referencing that scene in Casino that I also talk about on the show all the time. Or are they just too old, folks, because we're not making any progress? And we're going backwards, I think, on climate, war, and healthcare in this country. And why? Is it because of a gerontocracy? And I learned that word from Bill and his Substack. Is it just because we're too old? And let me bring this up on screen here. These are some Twitter feeds that people should be aware of. This is from the great Stephen Semler. He appears on my show quite frequently. I know Bill's aware of him too. He's a great guy. He's really good with charts and graphs and getting the statistical stuff and making it so people like me that aren't numbers people, dummies like me, can understand it. This is from President Biden's tweet. He says the Inflation Reduction Act invests $309 billion to take the most aggressive action ever in confronting the climate crisis and strengthening our energy security. It's allowing us to fight environmental injustice and deliver a clean energy economy. Now, remember what I said about climate, war, and healthcare and how they're interrelated. Semler points out that climate has gotten $309 billion in over 10 years from the federal government. The Pentagon gets 886 or $96 billion in 1 year. You throw in the Ukraine war and all that kind of stuff. Bill, we're well over $1 trillion. And again, the point that needs to be emphasized is this is annually renewable. That's 1 year. It never gets reduced. It always goes up. And here we are dying of climate, war, and healthcare. Look at the House of Mirrors here, not spending money on climate, spending it all on war, both of which are killing us, Bill.
Yeah, I think the classic case was when Biden finally ended the war in Afghanistan after 20 years, which should have saved us about $50 billion because that's how much the war was costing us. But instead of the defense budget, or I prefer the war budget, going down by 50 billion at the end of the Afghan war, the defense budget actually went up by 50 billion the next year. So even when wars end, the military spending continues to grow.
Yeah, and that Afghanistan thing can't be overstated. I mean, my God, within hours or days almost after we pulled out of there, Ukraine went, full tilt boogie. I mean, it was just like transitioning seamlessly and military industrial complex involvement and spending like nobody's business in Ukraine. Are they too dumb or are they in on it? Okay, let me bring this one up on screen here because this kind of went over the transom and not a lot of people paid a lot of attention to this, but I put this on my Twitter feed, and it has to do, I know you saw this, Bill, the outrage by Ukraine, or they were perplexed. They just couldn't figure out how Russia would destroy their grain because it costs more money to destroy it than was gained by the destruction of the grain. I put in here that I said, we've been so propagandized that we're unable to understand the true nature of war. Have we seen too many John Wayne movies, or are we just too dumb? Do we think some kind of cost benefit analysis is war? I thought this was from The Onion when I read that. But again, it does get to the, we don't understand war. You understand war. My God, Chris Hedges, read his Substack. He understands war. He's seen it firsthand. This is what war is. And it's a hell of a lot worse than this also, Bill.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. War is irrational. War is chaotic, and so, when you go to war, you just, there's that famous line from Shakespeare, cry havoc and unleash the dogs of war. It is havoc. You don't know what's going to happen. War is inherently unpredictable, messy, and murderous, of course. And the longer that wars last, tendency is that they intensify and become less and less predictable. And that's what I fear with the Russia-Ukraine war. The longer the war continues, without any serious talk of diplomacy, truce, or peace, the more likely it becomes that the war will spill over into other places or perhaps even go nuclear.
Yes, that's exactly where we're at Ukraine. Now, we're going to get to that in a little bit, but if we haven't crossed that Rubicon, we're getting very close to it, folks. And this was pointed out early on, particularly by Code Pink. I remember Medea Benjamin was on my show and she said, we need to get this resolved immediately, because if we don't, and all of this loss of life occurs and they dig in on both sides, it's going to be almost impossible to resolve. Okay, I want to get to this because I just walked by the TV last night and I see this, and I'm honest to God. So this is on the PBS NewsHour, folks. I posted this on Twitter, and they had this ghoul, this warmonger, John Kirby, on here talking about. Well, I'll just read the tweet. President Biden issued a new executive order that seeks to bolster the military's ability to deal with sexual abuse. To further discuss this, the reporter there, Lopez, I don't know what her first name is, but she spoke to John Kirby of the White House National Security Council. I looked at that and I thought, my God, did she ask if our $1 trillion military budget should be reduced? If fewer women and men should be in uniform right now, and the best way to protect women and men from being raped and killed in the military is to not have them in the military at all. And the highlighting there is mine, and that's what I wanted to get your response to, Bill. Do they need help with their questions? Because I talk on the show all the time. And let me okay, so this point is really made well by this guy right here, Noam Chomsky. He says the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissident views, again, within that spectrum. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. Of course, he's the co-author of Manufacturing Consent. So when you see this guy, this John Kirby on PBS talking about this, you think, well, hell, this guy's a women's right activist. I mean, this is the guy that we go to get our points of view for saving us, when in fact, those people are killing us. We spend this $1 trillion a year. We also have almost 800 plus military bases ringing the planet, protecting us from who the hell knows what. with people that don't need to be there. And guess what's happening? This kind of stuff is happening. But that question never gets asked, Bill. That they don't put you on the show to ask questions because I know you would.
No, there's a couple things going on here.
Yeah.
They don't want to talk about the fact that Biden has raised the military budget by 20% over the last 3 years. And Trump, it actually took him 4 years to raise the military budget 20%. They don't want to talk about the 750, 800 military bases around the world and how much they cost. So they talk about narrow issues. So on the right, there's a tendency to argue that the military is too woke. And on the left, or from the Democrats' point of view, they want to illustrate or highlight, what President Biden is doing to help, address sexual assault within the military. And now that is an important issue. And I think what the administration is doing there is probably an effective way of approaching a serious problem within the military. But here's the point: that doesn't impact the bottom line of the Pentagon budget at all. So that's why it's talked about on TV. They don't want to talk about the issues that affect war, that the war in Ukraine, the almost $900 billion budget. Instead, what they want us to focus on is side issues, like, not that they're unimportant, but issues like sexual assault or whether or not the military is too woke.
Yeah, and the tertiary, the extended part of this, I think I could get myself in a lot of trouble with my wife and other people for saying this. PBS, their primary demographic, the mass majority of their viewers are women Democrats. I mean, I just got to believe that it's got to be women over men. It's got to be Democrats over Republican, obviously. Well, holding this guy up is a paragon of protection and virtue for women in the military. I mean, it just kind of reinforces and accelerates this militaristic support and thinking in the country by extension. Now, okay, you say, George, you just think like that. Well, it's because I'm on the left. Now, PBS had all day, at least, to put that interview together. Why didn't they get someone to think like Bill and I? Why didn't they get at least one question submitted along those lines? That
Right.
never happens. They get the right-wing point of view. They get the mainstream, which is by and large the right-wing conservative point of view. And the people on the left that have been deplatformed, that have been demonized, that don't get access to the American public's way of thinking, they're never representative, and they weren't on this show either, Bill.
Right. Yeah. The issues are addressed are narrow, and not to repeat myself, but they don't affect the bottom line of the Pentagon budget. So no one's going to go on there and argue for any serious reduction to that budget, which is exactly what we need, because we continue to spend more and more on war. So much so that now we're speaking of this new Cold War with China and Russia. And of course, something like this would be a disaster in the context of climate change. What we need to do as a civilization, as human beings, is to cooperate. Not to be fighting wars against each other.
Got to. And if stretching credulity, the Space Force thing, honestly, God, if that doesn't make you want to take back your check from your taxes for the government, I mean, that ought to be an eye opener just in of itself. Let me bring up a couple of lighter hearted things here, because we talk about heavy things here. This is from Code Pink. I really like this. Medea Benjamin and those folks, the military industrial complex. There she is, the bouncing baby girl, there's the U.S. government on the right helping her and, teaching her how to swim or whatever. Here's the 140 million poor and low income Americans at the bottom left.
George, I had a thought there that you could almost switch, where the mother would be the military industrial complex.
Yes.
And the little girl would be the U.S. government.
Yes. That is the inverted totalitarianism that is our U.S. government now. We are under corporate fascism, basically. Sheldon Woolen, that I know
Yeah.
Bill again is well familiar with. Okay, let me. I want to bring this. Okay, here's another. This is funny. This is just a sign. Has anyone tried unplugging the United States and plugging it back in? That's the way that I feel at times, and that's a nice transition to, again, the real promotable, the topic of today's show. Are they too dumb, or are they in on it? There he is, podcast by George. And I said, thanks, Mitch. Waiting for the next congressional geezer to do his or her Walt Disney impersonation. Of course, Walt Disney is cryogenically frozen. Hopefully, people got to see McConnell's debacle on cable television. He froze up. I'm sure everybody's seen that. My God, these are the people that are running the country. Okay, I want to bring up your article in Bracing Views. I got a gerontocracy. That's not a commonly used term. I don't know if I'd ever heard it before, Bill, but I got to read about it in your Substack. And the decline of the U.S. empire. And instead of reading through this, because I've read a lot already, what I was surprised about reading this is that there's a precedent for what we're going through here in the United States. And it ain't from here. It's from those hated Ruskies. It's from the Soviet Union. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I remember when I was a teenager and I was in high school that we used to make fun in the U.S. media of or poke fun at the Soviet Union. These were the days of Leonid Brezhnev, followed by Andropov, I think, and Chernenko. These were all guys in their late 60s, mid 70s, not in the best of health, and we, the United States, we criticized, and I remember I think that's where I first ran across the term gerontocracy, because that's the term we used to describe the Soviet Union and its leaders, and now it seems like the joke's on us. Because when you look at Senator Dianne Feinstein, she's 90 years old. Her aides have to tell her to vote aye rather than making endless speeches. Of course, Mitch McConnell froze. And what really scared me there, George, was the reaction of the people around Mitch McConnell. They didn't really seem that concerned about his health. They were keeping up appearances. I mean,
yes, for the media. Joni Ernst was the woman in the foreground from Iowa. Yeah, exactly right. And I heard some people that kind of tried to excuse him a little bit, and he made a joke afterwards and that type of thing. And I don't want to be accused of being an ageist on this. But here's the point that I would make, and again, I play hockey. I'm not as good as I used to be, not just physically. I'm getting on in age, playing hockey as an example, or life in general. I'm not as sharp-witted. I'm not as quick thinking. I make mistakes. And the worst part about getting old is, for whatever reason, I don't understand it, you tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. It's like you're unlearning things. So that's what I would say about this. And I don't want to be mean-spirited. I mean, I respect the elderly. I've had shows devoted entirely to what's going on with the elder care abuse in this country through the nursing home systems and that type of thing. We need to revere and support our elders. Every good society, every successful community does that. We ain't doing it. But the times, because of climate war and healthcare, they're here. We got to be tough. And these people, clearly, the ones that we're talking about here, Bill, they're not capable. They need to be out of there.
Right. No, it's not about age. It's not about age. It's about competence. It's about health. And we've seen with people like Dianne Feinstein and Mitch McConnell, and of course, Joe Biden as well. I know he was giving a speech the other day where he was trying to think of, one word to define America, and he couldn't get it out. He couldn't get that word out, and it came out as gobbledygook. And people and the people who were behind him, like Kamala Harris was behind him. It's like they all act as if nothing's wrong, that Joe Biden's perfectly okay. Just like with Mitch McConnell, I mean, he could have been having a stroke on camera. And one of the first things they teach you, if not the first thing, if someone's having a stroke, you need to determine that as quickly as possible and get them medical help, because their brain from a stroke is being damaged. And yet
Yes.
people stood around like, hey, Mitch is fine. It's perfectly normal for Mitch to just stand there for a minute, frozen, where he can't even talk.
Yeah, reminds me of the only other time I'd seen anything like that. And people say, well, he just froze. He just, that happens to me too. There are times when I can't find the right word, even on my show. That's not what we're talking about here, folks. There was a short circuit there. There was an outage of some type. I'm reminded of a group that I like, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. They were at an awards presentation, and the drummer was going to do the acceptance, and got to the podium, and he just stood there for minutes. Now, he wasn't having a stroke, folks. He was that was a little something to do with the substance. But anyway, I digress. Let me let me bring this up on screen here, because I want to get to this. I highlighted this portion of the Substack article that we're talking about. An American gerontocracy with a near-death grip on power are holding back much-needed reforms here. Yeah, and I talk about this at all because what do? They long for yesteryear. Some of these people are almost old enough to long on the Republican side for the roaring 20s, for God's sake. But they want the status quo. They want the days of their youth back. And of course, that status quo is what got us to where we are and why we're dying because of climate war and healthcare, Bill.
Yes, yes, but it doesn't surprise me because, again, we remember when Joe Biden announced his candidacy, and I think the first person he went to was the CEO of Comcast or
Yes.
whomever. But basically, his promise was that nothing will fundamentally change under my administration, is what Joe Biden said, and that's the one promise that he's kept. Basically, nothing has changed. But I think we as Americans know, just looking around at our country, at all the people who are unhoused and all the people who are struggling. As my dad always said, and my dad was a firefighter and a factory worker, and my dad always said, the rich get richer and the poor poorer, and that's what we're witnessing in America today. It's the best of times for a few people, but the worst of times for an increasing number of Americans. So we desperately need change in our country. And yet it's an old guard in Washington that is suppressing that change.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've got the largest prison population in the world, and supposedly the country that loves freedom. 7 out of 10 of those people are Black or Hispanic. Well over 60%, almost 70% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. 1/3 of the deaths from COVID were attributed to a lack of health care. And again, we're blowing up people around the planet. Iraq is the best example of that. Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, for God's sake, went from being a African democracy to a open slave trading state, for God's sake, because of our involvement over there. All these things that the status quo has brought us, we're continuing to get from these elected officials. Let me move on here, because we got a lot of. This is something that I want to talk about a lot, because it has to do with this Russian-Ukraine war and the management of expectations. Now, Bill's all over this in his Substack, but you're not seeing as much reporting on this as you should, because we're kind of crossing a Rubicon right now. This thing is horrific. If it were to end peacefully, if peace were to break out today, it would still be a horrible stain on history, what's happened over there. But Bill writes, it can't be coincidence. In the past few days, I've seen articles at a mainstream media outlet like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal that the much hyped and much delayed Ukrainian spring counteroffensive has stalled, and at high cost to Ukrainian troops. Now, here's a quick headline from the New York Times on Monday. The war is approaching a violent stalemate. Ukraine has made only marginal progress lately and deploying less experienced soldiers after heavy casualties. And I'm no fan of the New York Times. We'll get to some more of that article, because I've always told people that they've pounded that war drum mightily and supported every war that we've been involved in. And that kind of looks like, to me, a little bit of what's going on there. Hey, Ukraine's getting its ass handed to it over there. NATO, U.S., needs to jump in and get involved and save those people in a war that we provoked and are largely responsible for. And this looks to me, Bill, like it's all about to go sideways.
No, you're right. It doesn't look good. And I think what worries me is again, I guess I was raised Catholic, and Pope Francis has come out and argued strenuously for diplomatic and peace effort in the Russia to end the Russia-Ukraine war, and there was even a papal envoy who came to the White House and spoke to Joe Biden. Yet I continue to hear nothing from the United States about trying to foster some kind of a diplomatic settlement. Now, some people will say, well, that's because the only thing Putin understands is military force, and so you have to defeat him. And it's like, well, sometimes I think that's the only thing we understand is military force. The longer this war goes on, the more Russians and Ukrainians die. The more Ukraine suffers because it's on Ukrainian territory that this war is being fought. So those who advocate that, hey, Ukraine has to win and we need to send them, cluster munitions so that we can, kill more Russians. Well, I mean, basically, yeah, maybe you kill more Russians, but you're also killing more Ukrainians while also risking a much worse war.
Yeah, and did you hear what Bill was talking about there? This was warned about by Bill. I mentioned Medea Benjamin earlier, the peace activists in the country. They said when this war broke out that if it goes on, if we don't reach a settlement very quickly, the loss of life is going to escalate dramatically. That's horrific in itself. Those people that are dead, they're having a bad day, folks. Dying will ruin your day. Let me tell you something.
Yeah.
We're talking about tens of thousands, maybe several hundred thousands of people have died already over there in Ukraine. What a horrible thing. But the most important upshot of that, and they made that point back then, so did Bill, the longer it goes on, the bigger the loss of life, the more entrenched both of these sides are, the less likely they are to settle, to negotiate, to sit down. And to show you about how dumb we are, in March 2022, when this thing first broke out, there was a possibility that it might get settled in Istanbul, in Turkey. There were talks underway. Boris Johnson sweeps in at the behest of NATO and the United States and tells Zelensky and the Ukrainians, don't you settle. I mean, we don't want a settlement. And they said that. I give them the benefit of the doubt here. I mean, you could make really evil assertions, but they were so dumb. They believed that Ukraine was going to win, that they were going to shove Russia back over the border and inflict losses and hurt Russia. Well, look where we are today. We're at that entrenched stage, and it's looking very bleak, Bill.
I like the way you were channeling the outlaw Josie Wales a little bit there. There's a great scene in the outlaw Josie Wales toward the end where a bounty hunter comes for Josie Wales, and basically, the bounty hunter says, he's after Josie, of course, Clint Eastwood, and says, well, it's a living, and Clint Eastwood, as Josie Wales turns to him and says, dying ain't much of a living, boy. And that's the truth. I mean, war is not much of a living. Although obviously there are some defense contractors who are making a killing.
Oh yeah.
War. But no, the war needs to stop. Unfortunately, from the U.S. perspective, and again, channeling Machiavelli here in the sense of if you want to look at it from purely power politics, which I don't, but there are people who are basically saying, well, we're weakening Russia, and that's a good thing. And so, and President Biden has stated that the goal here is regime change, that the United States basically wants Putin gone. And we see this as a way, I guess, we see this war as a way of weakening Putin and possibly even breaking up Russia. And so the question is okay, maybe we're weakening Russia, and maybe Putin will be weakened as well. Who knows? But we're doing it on the backs of the Ukrainian people.
And of course, I've always been terrified, and everyone should be, of the potential for even limited nuclear weaponry, a nuclear strike over there of some type. If the spring offensive were to work, if these bombs and munitions and support that we're providing Ukraine, if these were to work well enough that Russia really started to lose, that's when this nuclear thing becomes a little more realistic. Right now, maybe not, but it could. And the reverse is true. If Russia starts to win, and it kind of looks like they are, if the counteroffensive fails, if they start to overrun Ukraine, and I know Bill's a great scholar of World War I, if the Ukrainian troops do what France did in World War I, if they mutiny, if they quit or give up, guess what has to happen then? Well, maybe Poland, or maybe the United States, or maybe NATO decides to take up the fight. And you got to remember, this is all because of the existential threat to Russia, according to Russia, from NATO. If that were to happen, either one of these two scenarios, again, there's a real potential for a nuclear strike. And then one nuclear strike leads to two, leads to three, whatever, game over. That's what worries me. That's what almost keeps me awake at night, Bill.
Yeah. Hey, no, that's a great point, George. I don't think your casual listener would know about the French Army mutiny in World War I. It came in 1917 when the French launched a series of highly costly and failed offensives against the Germans, against the German lines. And so, when the French army mutinied, basically what France had to do was to tell the troops that, number one, we're not going to launch any more incredibly dumb offensives. But number two, the French knew that the United States had declared war, and that eventually the Yanks and more tanks were coming. So that's kind of what kept France in the war after that mutiny in 1917. And of course, eventually the French, along with the British and the United States, was able to defeat Germany in 1918. But the point is that war is, as we've already said, it's unpredictable, it's chaotic, it can be irrational, and what we really should be focusing on is putting an end to the war. Not throwing gasoline on the fire or cluster munitions on the Russians.
Well, yeah, and let's talk a little bit about ending the war. I mentioned back in March of 2022, if that had happened then, I think Russia, it wasn't hammered out, but Russia might have withdrawn to pre-invasion locations, got out of Ukraine, basically. Ukraine would have promised neutrality as far as NATO is concerned. Maybe they would have decided and stepped down as far as attacking Russians in Donbass is concerned, and maybe denazifying a little bit, which is what Russia expresses concern about. But, that was then. Now, that ain't happening. Those types of, by either side, neither side is going to relent. So if we do get something soon, let's hope, it probably, and I saw John Mearsheimer interviewed just recently. He used the term cold peace. Now, this is the guy that foretold all of this. This guy, he knows what he's talking about. He was right then. I got to believe he's right now. And he says, if there's a cold peace, he said, the situation is such, if that's looming, Russia needs to will take as much territory as it possibly can. Because if it has to give some up, then okay, we've got a bunch. That's the other downside of this. Right. But a cold peace, and we think about a cold war, but if they're just sitting there bristling with weaponry, NATO weaponry on one side, Russia weaponry on the other side, looking across a fence at one another at a divided Ukraine, it's very easily for worse hostilities to break out this time. And again, that specter of nuclear war, Bill.
Right. Yeah, a cold peace sounds a little bit like the sort of armistice that we have in Korea.
Yes.
You basically have South Korea on one side, North Korea on the other, with a demilitarized zone, both of them glaring at each other, because technically the Korean War still isn't over. Yes. It's frozen. It's frozen in an armistice, but it's, we never did declare we never did declare peace there.
A comment coming in here. I want to be able to get to these comments. I loved this particular commenter, Mary Knox. She says, "Are we weakening Russia? In some ways, the tables are turning as Russia is finding new trade partners. Yeah, even changing the global trade currency from the U.S. dollar to the Chinese yuan. Sure, it's far from complete, But Russia has some new allies. Again, this goes back to are they too dumb or are they in on it? Our people should have known this. I mean, we should have known that Russia was rich in natural resources and that sanctions were not going to work, that Russia had a huge military and was not going to be easily defeated in Ukraine. Again, flashing back to what I'm talking about with Boris Johnson. Why in the hell did we do this? Well, it can't be undone. It's already happened, but let's learn from history at the very least. But her question is, are we weakening Russia? Well, maybe a little. I don't know. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah. No, I think we were surprised at how resilient the Ukrainians proved to be in the first few weeks of the war. And now we've been surprised at how resilient Russia has been.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. Russia, if we drive Russia more closely into the arms of China, for example, that is most definitely a lose for the United States. I mean, part of our whole Cold War policy, getting back to Richard Nixon, Nixon went to China with Kissinger to try to keep, to try to divide what we saw as a monolithic communist bloc. So if this effort with Ukraine and Russia ends up driving the Russians to work more closely with the Chinese, that is most definitely a lose for our strategic foreign policy, such as it is.
Yeah, and maybe the biggest loser in all of this, again, well, Russia, because of their loss of life. Also, Ukraine, my God, the loss of life, the devastation of their country. And if this cold peace is the only thing that we can do right now, Mearsheimer is the first guy to point out Ukraine's probably going to become a rump state of Russia. I mean, absolutely what they don't want. The only way to prevent that from happening, again, is NATO involvement and all-out war. And you think we've lost so far? Were they too dumb or were they in on it? My bottom line on this is, my God, at the very least, do not elect people, do not support political parties that were responsible for this. So let me bring up Bill's article here again to see if there's anything that I'm overlooking here. And he says, only time and lots more dead will tell. Yeah, there's no certainties with this because we're talking about war, this chaos that Bill was talking about. Supporters of Ukraine allege that progress is being made, that Russia is suffering more dearly, and the U.S. NATO aid must continue at the highest possible level to ensure that the forces of democracy will prevail. Okay, tell us why you laugh there, Bill, because again, the forces of democracy, when it comes to Ukraine and the circumstance over there, it is kind of laughable.
Well, I mean, I have debates obviously with people when before I write these pieces, I'm often interacting with friends and other people, and the idea being that that we have a conceit as a nation. Certainly, our government does that wherever United States troops go or wherever our weapons go, that they're on the side of democracy. And yet, of course, we don't really have democracy in America anymore. And if you know anything about Ukraine, Ukraine, as far as corruption is concerned, rated among the highest, if not the highest, in corruption of the countries in Europe, prior to the beginning of the war. So people will often say to me, well, come on, Bill, Ukraine is an imperfect democracy, true, but we need to support that fledgling democracy. And my rejoinder is that we really need to focus on the democracy right here in the United States because our democracy is failing.
I mean, we haven't got anything right here of late. That's for sure. You don't need to look any further than our electoral process, which is obviously broken. The parts that they want to put Trump in shackles for, but my God, the DNC won't even allow a debate. That is a pretty good sign that democracy is failing in this country. What happened to Bernie in 2016 and again in 2020? That's another good indication of it. The entire country is upside down, and we want to go around talking about democracy.
To turn the tables on you, how do Iowans feel about their primary or their caucus being demoted? Because I'm up here near New Hampshire, and traditionally New Hampshire is the first big primary, and the Democrats have DNC has basically intervened to sideline Iowa and New Hampshire in support of Joe Biden. Of course, I guess South Carolina now I think is the first state to have a primary. So how do you all feel about being demoted?
Well, there's a couple of things I would say, and it goes back to Bernie, of course. Everybody talks about his candidacy and what a rebel he was and that type of thing. Got to remember, Bernie's a Democrat. Bernie was a Democrat. He is a Democrat. He will always be a Democrat. Those people that supported Bernie in this state, they were Democrats, basically. Yeah, they like Bernie. They supported him, but they support the Democratic Party's position. And that's it. That's what they're going to do. And they're going to go along with it. There's a lot of money, a lot of corporate involvement here that's involved, but that's what the Democrats are going to do in this state. They'll go along with this. And as you mentioned briefly there, the Democrats, the last thing they want to do is get off to another flying stop in Iowa with a candidate like Cornel West as an example, or even Robert Kennedy Jr.
Right.
If that were to happen in Iowa, most likely Kennedy or even Cornell would win the damn primary, or the caucus rather, and they do not want that happening. They're going to go to South Carolina, New Hampshire, maybe someplace like that, and make sure that doesn't happen. So that's kind of my take on the overall thing. I mean, it's overstated to think that anybody in this state is anything, even Bernie supporters, or anything more than mainline Democrats. We're finding that out. And of course, this is a red state overall. So I don't know if that's a good explanation, but here's Mary Knox. She might have an explanation. Our Democratic caucus is up in the air right now. Iowa does not want to allow ballots by mail and have forbade it. Democrats say they will do it anyway. Okay. And New Hampshire says they're going to have the first in the nation primary anyway. Bill, is that the last that you've heard, that they're going to go?
Oh, I don't know. I didn't hear that, but Bobby Kennedy, I was listening to Bobby Kennedy the other day, and he made a really good point, because he said that with Iowa and with New Hampshire, you actually have a process that's somewhat democratic, because you have candidates who get out there on the ground and they go around, they visit people in Iowa, they go to farms, they go to small communities, they go to barbershops and so on, and village stores. And the same is true of New Hampshire. Yet South Carolina, you don't have that same, it's more of a machine, which is probably why the DNC selected it.
Yes.
They can count on the machinery to anoint Joe Biden once again.
Yeah. And so our progressive or left-wing voices don't get heard. Okay, I want to bring this up very quickly here, and because we're about out of time, I'll just read the headline on this. The rationale of America's wars, reason and rationality have little to do with them. And I had the great Chris Hedges on my show, and we talked about this type of thing at length. The gaslighting, the propagandizing. Hollywood's largely responsible for this jingoistic, nutty perspective that we have about war, which is not reality, is what's holding us back and harming us to such a great extent in this country, Bill.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's we have a view of war that's really kind of an antiseptic one. I wrote an article many years ago. I called it the new American isolationism. And what I meant by that is that we the American people are kept isolated largely from the costs of war. So, unless you have a family member who served in the military and got wounded or killed, or is suffering from, PTSD or traumatic brain injury or so on, you really have no idea how much damage that war does. I mean, United States, we haven't really suffered the ravages of war since the United States, Civil War in the 1860s. I mean, yes, we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. That was obviously very localized. The same with 9/11. We haven't seen war the way wars are fought for a long time.
Yeah, and maybe for my part of it here, I'll end it again, and it's a good part because it's a big issue with me. Julian Assange sits in Belmarsh, and the biggest reason is I think that he released and revealed that collateral murder video of that helicopter strike out there. And I think it was Matthew Ho that told me that his first reaction to that, and maybe on network television or wherever it was that they showed it to him, was, my God, what do you think we were doing over there? What do you think war is? That you do know, or you do understand, that the primary victims of war actually are not the soldiers through history. It's the civilians. It's the innocents. That's what That's what this is. That's what we're talking about. And they've got him over there locked up, I think, because he was revealing that to people.
No, that's a good point. I just posted a piece on my Bracing Views Substack today, where I quoted a Air Force Master Sergeant from 2007 during the Iraq War, right around when that video happened, collateral murder, and the Master Sergeant was arguing for the Air Force that the Air Force was making war too easy in the sense that we were so precise we could drop a bomb on a mud hut without doing any damage to anything else. You see, that's the image of war that we're being sold,
Yes.
that we're super precise, surgical, we only kill the bad guys, and therefore you Americans, as George W. Bush said as president, don't worry about that stuff. Visit Disney, go about your lives, let the best and the brightest handle it. And that is something, as the saying goes, war is far too important to be left to generals.
Yes. And that's what he's doing. George W. I mean, he's, I don't know if he's at Disney or not. He was dancing with Ellen on television, and there's all kinds of evidence out there that they knew copacetically that was a lie, that there were no WMDs, that was not a justification for that war before they went in there. Okay, we're out of time here. I'm coming up on the top of the hour. I like to hold these to within an hour or so, Bill, but I do like to give you the last word because you're good at it. Again, go to bracingviewssubstack.com and get all of Bill's writings, because I mean, if I could write like that, folks, I would, but I can't. But anyway, I'm going to turn this over to him, and Bill, give us a close here, put a bow on it, wrap this edition up, and I'll come back after your statement.
All right. Well, I think what we have to do is we have to remember that what patriotism is all about. I served my country for 20 years in the Air Force, and I think if I had to summarize it in a single sentence, it would be, patriotism is critical love of our country. So it's not blind love. And so we need to inform ourselves about, what our leaders, so-called leaders, are up to. And we also need to take a look inside ourselves. I was raised Catholic. I still consider myself to be a Christian. And the good book teaches us that, blessed are the peacemakers, not the warmongers. And so we need to remember that we should be seeking a world with greater peace. And if our country isn't doing that, well, there's something seriously wrong with our country.
That's great. That's a great close. That's a great wrap up. Bill Astore with, I mean, he's probably other places, but you can communicate with him. You can subscribe at bracingviews.substack.com. Any other websites or addresses or anything you'd like to put on there, Bill?
No, Bracing Views. I've got a new article coming out at Tom Dispatch, I think, next week. I've written over 100 for Tom Engelhardt.
Right. Yeah.
And just so you know, I started writing for Tom in 2007. And I thought I'd write like 1, 2, 3 articles. I ended up writing, this is like my 102nd, something like that.
Well, that's like me. I'm coming up on 5 years of this show. I've done over 500 episodes. My God, it is amazing how time gets away from you. Bill Astore, thanks again for coming on this podcast by George Liveline.
Thank you, George.
I will talk again soon, pal. And folks, if you like seeing Bill Astore, if you like hearing his points of view, if you love his Substack like I do, come to podcastbygeorge.com where you can see him and hear from him, communicate with him, ask a question or two like Mary Knox did. And you can find out where we're at and subscribe very easily to the various platforms at podcastbygeorge.com. There are little icons there, little badges that take you right to Facebook and the YouTube home, as an example, for the live streams for Podcast by George. Take you right there. Sign up very easily. And on YouTube, we'll make sure you ring that notification bell so that you get notified of when the next one's coming up. There are also badges, icons for the audio platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, it's called, places like that. It's all at podcastbygeorge.com. But folks, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.